In Episode 7, we took a brief look at a creature known as the Pukwudgie, loosely translated as Little Man of the Woods that Vanishes. But these little people of the forest are not the only mysterious creatures that are said to inhabit the unknown parts of our world. On today's show, we're going to dig a little deeper and begin an exploration of some of the history and odd encounters regarding these and many other creatures that are the focal point of fairy tales. Creatures known as the Fae.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision, I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7-8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
Welcome to the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast. I am your host, Nick Ryan. As always, I'd like to start out the show by saying a huge thank you to our wonderful patrons. Robin, Cassandra, Julie, Courtney, Tiffany, Mystica, Carly, Kyriakos, Unica, Mary, Sarah, Angie, Nick, James S., Molly, Maddie, Carrie, Colin, Chris, Christy, Buster, Michael, Kim, and our 3 newest patrons, Amanda, Yvonne, and Santiago. Your support and generosity is truly amazing, and it makes our podcast possible. Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we daren't go a-hunting, for fear of little men. We folk, good folk, trooping all together, green jacket, red cap, and a white owl's feather. Down along the rocky shore, some make their home. They live on crispy pancakes of yellow tide foam. Some in the reeds of the Black Mountain Lake, with frogs for their watchdogs, all night awake. High on the hilltop, the old king sits. He is now so old and gray, he nigh lost his wits. With a bridge of white mist, column kill he crosses, on his stately journeys, from Sleeveleague to Ross's. Or going up with the music, on cold starry nights, to sup with the queen of the gay northern lights. They stole little Bridget for 7 years long. When she came down again, her friends were all gone. They took her lightly back, between the night and morrow. They thought that she was fast asleep, but she was dead with sorrow. They have kept her ever since, deep within the lake, on a bed of fig leaves, watching till she wake. By the craggy hillside, through the mosses bare, they have planted thorn trees, for my pleasure, here and there. Is any man so daring as dig them up in spite? He shall find their sharpest thorns in his bed at night. Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we daren't go a-hunting, for fear of little men. We folk, good folk, trooping all together, green jacket, red cap, and a white owl's feather. William Allingham's poem, The Fairies, urges me to pose a question. Do you believe in fairies? It may seem like an absurd thing to ask, but the question may be more relevant than you think. For many of us, fairy tales represent a defining part of our childhood, and possibly the very first genre of books that we were introduced to as kids. For the most part, I think it's safe to assume that as we get older, we tend to think of fairy tales as a collection of fictitious stories that are only meant for children. But what if that wasn't entirely true? What if some of these stories and the characters within their pages were actually based in some sort of reality? After all, almost every tall tale begins with a grain of truth. In fact, fairy tales and stories of fae folk date back at least as far as the 8th century BC, around the time that Homer wrote the Iliad. That's almost 3,000 years ago, and when something endures that long, I think it only makes sense to give it the attention that it deserves, and ask ourselves if any of these stories could actually be true. But first, we need to understand what the term fae folk actually encompasses. In recent decades, the most famous of the fae would of course be fairies. From popular movies and cartoons to mainstream children's books, fairies are what many of us think of when we hear the term fairy tale or even folklore. But the fairies portrayed in today's mainstream media are a heavily watered-down version of what they were traditionally believed to be. Nowadays, it seems like fairies are thought of as sweet and helpful forest dwellers that playfully perch on toadstools, but in many cultures, they are believed to be tricksters, and in some cases, even downright malevolent. So, what are fairies exactly? The word fairy, spelled F-A-I-R-Y, originates from the French word fairy, spelled F-A-E-R-I-E, a spelling which is still occasionally used to this day. In addition, fairies as a whole are also known as the fae, spelled F-A-E. So what does fae mean? Well, it's a term which both describes what they are physically and who they are culturally. The fae, in the broadest sense, are all those who belong to the order of fairies, including those creatures which seem to be disconnected from the classic fairy archetype and are likely not to match mentally with most people's images of what a fairy really is. That said, fairies or fae, in the most commonly understood sense, can best be described as small humanoid creatures who have thin, membranous wings and generally tend to stay away from humans. This definition is very similar to the classic fairy, but it tends to get stretched out a bit when we are talking about other creatures that can fall into the category of fae. Although the traditional fairy is the most well-known, pixies, elves, banshees, brownies, goblins, leprechauns, satyrs, nymphs, valkyries, gnomes, sylphs, and even dwarves all fall under the classic definition of fae folk. Modern fairies are said to have an iridescent glow to them, and many are considered to be at least partially immortal. Unlike other immortals, though, fairies are not indestructible. It is believed that fairies can be killed, but they do not die of natural causes. That is, even though they most certainly can die, they won't die of old age or a natural failure of the body. In this way, many fairies are considered to be hundreds, if not thousands, of years old. Most popular in European folklore, especially Celtic, Slavic, German, English, and French, legends regarding fairies and other fae folk talk about the need to ward them off using protective charms. Common examples of such charms include church bells, wearing clothing inside out, four-leaf clovers, and food. In fact, before the advent of modern medicine, fairies were often blamed for sickness, particularly tuberculosis and birth deformities. In parts of England and Britain, it was believed that if a baby was ill, chances were good that it was not a human infant at all, but a changeling, left by the fae. If left exposed on a hillside, the fae could come and reclaim it. William Butler Yeats relates a Welsh version of this story in his tale called The Stolen Child. Parents of a new baby could keep their child safe from abduction by the fae by using one of several simple charms. A wreath of oak and ivy kept fairies out of the house, as did iron or salt placed across the doorstep. Also, the father's shirt draped over the cradle keeps the fae from stealing a child. In some stories, examples are given of how one can see a fairy. It is believed that a wash of marigold water rubbed around the eyes can give mortals the ability to spot the fae. It is also believed that if you sit under a full moon in a grove that has trees of ash, oak, and thorn, the fae will appear. Fairies were also sometimes thought to haunt specific locations and to lead travelers astray, using will-o'-the-wisps. These so-called fairy lights are described as an atmospheric ghost light seen by travelers at night, especially over bogs, swamps, or marshes. This phenomenon is known in English folk belief, English folklore, and much of European folklore by a variety of names, including Fool's Fire, Jack-o'-lantern, Friar's Lantern, Hinky Punk, and Hobby Lantern, and is said to mislead travelers by resembling a flickering lamp or lantern. Even today, many people believe that these lights, and in some cases the fae folk, are the reason for some of the strangest missing person cases that are still unsolved. In many encounters, eyewitnesses claim to feel a strong, unexplained urge to follow these lights, or the fae themselves, when they see them. Some have even claimed that they witnessed fae folk beckoning to them to follow them deep into the forest. But if we assume for a moment that these creatures do in fact exist, what are they, and where did they come from? One of the most popular theories is that they are elementals, magical entities who personify a particular force of nature and exert powers over these forces. Others speculate that they could be demoted angels or pagan deities, spirits of the dead, or possibly even demons. Whatever they are, eyewitnesses that have come face to face with these creatures tell some of the most bizarre stories that I've ever heard. We'll begin tonight with one such tale that took place at Knapp Hill in Wiltshire, England, witnessed by a man named Matthew Williams in the summer of 1996. Williams says, "I was sitting in the car around 9 o'clock at night and suddenly saw this light that seemed to be coming from Adam's grave, a 196-foot long, 19-foot high, long barrow with an ancient burial chamber at its southeast end, which is on Walker's Hill. I had all my equipment with me, cameras, night scopes, and binoculars, and so I jumped out of the car and I focused on Adam's grave. It was a bright, moonlit night, and Walker's Hill was all lit up. Through the binoculars, I could see a chap on top, holding what seemed to be a torch. I could tell he was wearing what looked like either a long, dark coat or black cloak, so I then got my night vision equipment for a better look, and could see he was walking back and forth on Adam's grave. Well, I watched him for a few minutes, and then went back to the car to get some food. Then, about 10 minutes later, I thought I'd take a look again. When I looked up again, I could see that there was a group of figures standing in a circle around this man. What was stranger was that I could only make out their shape, but not their clothing. As I watched, they began what looked like a dance, a ritual dance like those of Native Americans. But the weirdest thing was that he just stood there, and it was like he couldn't even see them. Whatever these creatures were, they suddenly began to shrink in size to about the size of small children. They carried on doing the wild dance-like ceremony, but what was odd was they seemed to glitter, particularly on their arms, like little globes of light flickering. I thought, what the hell are they? So I packed the equipment back in the car, edged my way towards Adam's grave, and hoped no one could see me, and then sprinted the last bit to surprise them and see what was going on. But when I got there, the figures were gone, and the chap was gone too. The moon lit up the whole area, but there was no one. Nothing. I stood around for a while, searched out the whole area, and then went back to the car. There wasn't really much more I could do. Another similar encounter involved a man named W.E. Thorner of Luton, Bedfordshire, England, in 1943, on the island of Hoy, in the Orkney Islands of Scotland. Thorner witnessed the following. One stormy day in winter, I was walking or struggling along the cliff top at Hornice. The wind was high and howled about. Low-lying, swirling clouds part enveloped the land in misty rain. At times, the pressure was so great that I was forced to bend and clutch at the heather to retain a footing. On one such occasion, on looking up, I was amazed to see that I had the company of what appeared to be a dozen or more wild men dancing about to and fro. These creatures were small in stature, but they did not have long noses, nor did they appear kindly in demeanor. They possessed round faces, sallow in complexion, with long, dark, bedraggled hair. As they danced about, seeming to throw themselves over the cliff edge, I felt I was witness to some ritual dance of a tribe of primitive men. It is difficult to describe in a few words my feelings at this juncture, or my bewilderment. The whole sequence could have lasted about 3 minutes, until I was able to leave the cliff edge. The next story I'd like to share comes from an article on Mysterious Universe called Strange Encounters with the Mysterious Little People of Detroit. While the article is a bit long, it includes some interesting history regarding gnome or goblin-like creatures. The article says, throughout the world, from nearly every culture, there are tales of little people. Fairies, gnomes, elves, goblins, all manner of tiny, strange beings inhabit the lore of these places, and in many cases, these creatures are seen as quite real indeed. Occasionally, one can find such stories in the last place one might expect, and one such type of gnome or little person has been reported from the area of Detroit, Michigan for centuries. Far from merely a bit of folklore, there have been actual sightings of these beings dating from before European settlement all the way up to the modern day, and the mysterious little people of Detroit are one of the more bizarre stories of such creatures out there. The tale has its origins with the Ottawa tribe, which inhabited the area in and around what would become Detroit, Michigan in the United States, and revolves around the curious entities known as the Nain Rouge, or Red Dwarf. Contrary to the image one may have of Detroit today, this was once an untamed wilderness, populated by all manner of spirit folk of Native American legend, and these were among them. The creatures, which would come to be known as the Nain Rouge, were said to be indeed mischievous, as are many supposed little folk in other traditions, but were also protectors of the land, powerful nature spirits that were caretakers of the earth. With the coming of the first French settlers, the newcomers to this land brought their own visions of the mythology of their homelands, based on the fairy-like entity known as the Lutin, which had its origins in Normandy. The Lutin were long considered to be mean-spirited trickster spirits, prone to prankish behavior, and seemed a perfect fit for the strange gnomes of the natives, the two traditions becoming intertwined. The image of these mythical creatures began to change and evolve with European settlement, and they instead began to be seen as not mostly benevolent forest entities, but rather harbingers of doom and destruction, with the sight of one believed to be an almost certain omen of bad things to come. During these days, the Nain Rouge were described as small, child-sized humanoids with red, old man faces, glowing eyes, jagged and yellow, rotten teeth, and dressed in worn-down clothes, pointed hats, and fur boots, or sometimes without clothing and covered in a matted, reddish-brown hair. While this may all seem to be purely the stuff of folklore and legend, alleged real encounters with these mysterious diminutive entities go way back, and they were routinely seen by the native tribes, who considered them to be very much real. One of the earliest such reports from a European starts in 1701, when the founder of Detroit, Antoine de la Matthe Cadillac, was having a party on March 10th of that year. During this event, a mysterious fortune-teller allegedly appeared with a cat on her shoulder, and when she read his palm, she told him that he was destined to start a great city, but that this new colony would be the place of great strife and bloodshed. She also warned him to pay heed to the Nain Rouge, and to not upset it, as this would certainly mean his downfall, which the skeptical leader mostly scoffed at. When Cadillac finally did found the city, he reportedly went out with his wife one night for a quiet walk and overheard two men complaining about the new city, with one of them saying that he had seen Le Petit Nain Rouge, which was a sure sign of bad things to come. At the time, this amused Cadillac, but soon after he reported that a deformed, dwarf-like creature, covered in blackish-red fur and with beady, fierce red eyes, shambled into view, and that it had crooked, horrendous teeth. Cadillac allegedly bashed the foul creature over the head with a cane and told it to go away, but the fearsome gnome just laughed and scampered off. After that, Cadillac was supposedly beset by myriad misfortune, eventually dying alone and penniless. The creature was spotted multiple times at around the same time, with one frightened farmer claiming to have seen it on the roof of a barn, trying to rile up the horses, and another farmer claimed that the thing would appear at night to peer into his windows and steal his chickens. More well-known than these scattered sightings was an encounter with one of the little beasts on July 30th, 1763. On this day, 250 British troops had amassed in preparation for a surprise attack on a rebel force made up of a confederacy of Native Americans that had defied British post-war policies in an insurgent uprising known as Pontiac's War, named after one of its fiercest leaders, the Ottawa chief Pontiac. The war itself had devolved into a brutal, ruthless campaign that involved various atrocities, such as slaughtering civilians and unceremoniously executing helpless prisoners, and the British were eager to squash the violent rebellion as quickly as possible. On this day, what would end up being called the Battle of Bloody Run, the British forces crept up along a tributary of the Detroit River called Parents Creek, on their way towards Pontiac's encampment, hoping to launch a decisive surprise attack against the chief, but they were surprised to find a large contingent of 400 angry Native American warriors waiting for them and ready to fight. The ensuing battle would drive the British back and was said to be so bloody and vicious that the creek ran red with blood, changing its name to Bloody Run. Nearly 60 British soldiers would die in the melee, including the commander of the force, Captain James Dalyell, whose corpse was decapitated so that his head could be paraded around on a stick for all to see. Eyewitnesses, including many of the soldiers themselves, would claim that they had seen one of the Nain Rouge sitting upon the banks of the creek before the battle, as if claiming a front-row seat and waiting with glee to witness the carnage. In the aftermath of the fighting, the fearsome little dwarf was then allegedly witnessed to frolic and dance amongst the corpses that littered the ground, and to wade about in the blood-stained waters of the creek. The creature's demeanor was described as being joyous and elated, as if celebrating the bloodshed. The reputation of the Nain Rouge as being a portent of death and disaster continued in the days before the Great Detroit Fire of 1805, which would burn most of the city to the ground. In the days leading up to the fire, the dreaded Nain Rouge was reportedly seen numerous times by the citizens, with some even claiming that they saw the evil little red man dancing in the flames when the disaster struck. Then, the creature was seen again in the aftermath of the War of 1812, when the defeated General William Hull reported seeing it peering from the fog on the sidelines and grinning with its disgusting teeth during his surrender of Detroit in 1813. Hull would later be historically executed for military incompetence. Sightings and scary encounters with the Nain Rouge would continue into later years as well. In October of 1872, one woman named Jane Dacey claimed that she had just come back to her house on Elizabeth Street from running errands when she encountered what she described as a creature with blood-red eyes, long teeth, and rattling hooves lurking in a darkened room. The encounter was reportedly so shocking to Dacey that she passed out and ended up bedridden for some time. In 1884, another woman claimed to have been savagely attacked and beaten as she walked along a street at night by a beast that looked like a baboon with a horned head, brilliant, restless eyes, and a devilish leer on its face. With the coming of the 20th century, the malevolent little beast or beasts were still up to their tricks. The creature was sighted a few times before the 1967 Detroit uprising, which was one of an epidemic of race riots that was sweeping the nation at the time, and was one of the most destructive and violent riots the country has ever seen. One witness at the time described the creature as doing backflips and cartwheels down 12th Street during the police raid of a bar that ignited the whole fiasco. Then in 1976, 2 utility workers reported seeing the Nain Rouge climbing up a utility pole just before one of the worst snowstorms in the city's history rolled through in March of that year. They apparently thought it was a child climbing the pole until it leapt down to the ground, and they could see that it was actually the legendary Nain Rouge. There are more recent alleged sightings of the Nain Rouge as well. In 1996, the Michigan Believer ran a story about a pair of witnesses who claimed they had just exited a nightclub when they saw a tiny, hunched-over man wearing what looked like a filthy, tattered old fur coat flee an attempted car burglary while making a cawing sound similar to a crow. As recently as 2017, there have been reports of the Nain Rouge. One commenter on Reddit gave 2 curious accounts of what appears to be the creature. They had this to say. These 2 stories came from 2 people who knew nothing of the other. My great-aunt says when she was little, she saw a gnome on several occasions. It would stare at her and even follow her. The last time she saw it was at a funeral home, and it wanted her to go into a cellar, and she felt it was evil by then. When she told me and my sister this story as an old woman, she looked disturbed and said she had carried a cross ever since. My sister and I were very young, so we didn't really get many details. One regret I have is not finding out more. My family believed her, or at least believed that she thought she saw it. No one is alive that would have any more information about her sighting or encounter. The next person's related account was my close friend's older sister. She said she was chased by an evil little creature at her bus stop. She described it as a gnome, and my friends would clown on her about it. And now that I'm older and more mature, and very much interested in the supernatural, I regret not listening to her. She had a hard time even talking about it, or when we would joke about it. She said it was very small, smaller than she was as an 8-year-old girl. It had white fur, and a pointy red hat. Is there anything to these sorts of tales, or is this all myth and urban legend? After all, cultures around the world have their own versions of mysterious elves, gnomes, and other trickster spirits in their lore. So is this perhaps just the Detroit region's own unique little people myth? Or do these stories have something to them? And if the Nain Rouge is real at all, then what could it be? It is interesting to note that the appearance of the notorious Red Dwarf has historically been very often cited before or during tragedies or disasters, which is very much in keeping with reports of other ominous entities that serve as portents of doom, such as the well-known Mothman of Point Pleasant. Could the Nain Rouge be a similar such mysterious apparition, or even the same one, in a different form? Related to this line of questioning is just why the Nain Rouge should go from the beneficial nature spirit protector it was traditionally seen as in Native American lore to the seemingly evil creature depicted upon the arrival of the Europeans. But if the being or beings is at all real, then this could be because it or they simply did not take kindly to these outsiders coming into their land. It could also be that we have misunderstood them, and that they are not causing the disasters in any way, but rather trying to warn us in their own way. And in this sense, they could still be considered protectors or guardians of a sort. It is interesting to think about and to ponder just what lies at the bottom of these bizarre stories and reports. Regardless of whether the Nain Rouge is actually real or not, the city of Detroit has adopted it as sort of a mascot. There has historically been a yearly parade called the March du Nain Rouge, in which costume revelers ceremoniously chase the red dwarf out of the city and conclude with burning an effigy of the creature, which will banish the imp from the city for another year. There is also a brewery in the city that produces Detroit Dwarf Lager, and a wine importer in the city has its own Nain Rouge Red. Even if the Nain Rouge was never real, it still seems to maintain a presence in the city to some degree, nonetheless. Another article regarding a creepy gnome-like creature involved two different families, but the same actual house. The first story includes a woman named Tammy and her 3 children. The second story includes a woman named Charlie, her husband, their 2 kids, and 2 dogs. The article starts by saying this: When Tammy moved herself and her 3 children to the country house by the Toole River near Porterville, California, she didn't know something wicked was waiting for them. We always got the feeling of being watched, Tammy said. One spot on the farm especially put her on edge: the barn. The family animals, dogs, a cat, turkeys, chickens, and ducks avoided that rickety dark building. We had had a lot more chickens and ducks, but they had started disappearing, Tammy said. I also noticed that none of the neighbors' animals, or stray animals for that matter, would go anywhere near that barn. It was without a doubt just creepy. She soon discovered why. One evening my son, who was 7 years old at the time, and I had just come back from grocery shopping, Tammy said. We parked and got out of the car, and as I was opening up the back to get the groceries out, I noticed movement out of the corner of my right eye. As she lifted the grocery sack from the car, she saw the movement again. This time, I heard a very freaky, very evil-sounding chuckle, she said. I looked in the direction of the sound, and there, standing about 50 yards from my son and I, was what I can only describe as a gnome. The creature, about 2 to 3 feet tall, wore baggy black pants and a gold-colored shirt. A salt and pepper beard ran from beneath a red, pointed hat. That thing grinned at us, and the creepy grin spread from ear to ear, and its teeth were a gross brown and pointed or jagged, she said. It had a bulbous nose and large, deep-set eyes. She dropped the groceries and grabbed her son. The wicked little man cackled after her as she ran to the house. Tammy burst inside through the kitchen and slammed the door. As she tried to tell her daughters about her panic, something moved outside the kitchen window. She looked and saw the top of the thing's red-pointed hat. It had to be about 10 feet off the ground. The thing eventually disappeared from the window, and Tammy retrieved the groceries from the car. She never saw it again, but until the day she moved, she heard the gnome's creepy chuckle coming from the old barn. Although Tammy's family had gone, the gnome wasn't finished terrorizing whoever lived in that house. Charlie, her husband, their 2-year-old twin girls, and 2 golden Labrador retrievers moved into the 2-story house by the river in March 2010. The house was perfect for us, she said. Exactly what we were looking for, and we couldn't wait to move in. There were 3 bedrooms, a huge kitchen, dining room, and living room, and lots of windows all around it. The deck opened off the back door, overlooked the woods and the nearby Toole River. A deck in the front of the house overlooked a pond. Charlie placed fairy, gnome, and toadstool yard ornaments around the pond and stocked it with Japanese koi fish to make it feel more like their home. The feeling wouldn't last. One day while walking back from the river to the house with her daughters and their dogs, the dogs became riled. As they approached a rickety outbuilding that Charlie called the shack, the dogs began to snarl and bark, the hair on their backs standing up. Something told me to run, so I grabbed a twin under each arm and ran for home, she said. Something about that shack gave me the creeps, especially at night, but I don't know why. She began to notice none of the animals, not even wildlife or stray cats, would go near the shack, until the day she heard the fight coming from inside. It sounded like a cat was in a fight with something way bigger than it was, she said. Her husband grabbed a flashlight and ran to the shed. Just as he got to the door, the noise stopped, she said. He went in and looked around with the flashlight. There was a cat. It was totally skinned on one side, and its neck looked as though something had taken a huge chunk out of it. He stepped outside the shack to catch his breath, and when he looked back in, the cat was gone. There was no way that that cat had moved itself, she said. We were standing right there. Where did that cat go? They soon discovered that the cat was the least of their worries. One night, around 3 a.m., a raspy, gurgling singing woke Charlie and her husband from sleep. It was without a doubt the most hideous sound I have ever heard, she said. It freaked us out. Charlie and her husband looked out their bedroom window and saw something that challenged their sanity. Standing by my pond, holding one of my garden gnomes, was what I can only describe as something out of a Grimm's fairy tale, she said. The thing that was standing in our yard was hideous and grotesque. A human-like creature stood under the bright light of the motion detector. It was 2 to 3 feet tall, with a long gray beard, maroon pants, baggy yellow shirt, brown vest, a dark waistcoat, and a reddish-brown pointed hat. The thing that made this creature really hideous was its eyes and teeth, she said. It looked like it was grinning, and its teeth were jagged and pointed. The eyes were little, beady, dark, and mean. As the creature stared at Charlie and her husband, it reached into the pond and grabbed a koi, dropped the fish into its mouth, and swallowed. Charlie's husband pushed the window open a few inches and screamed at the creature, telling it to leave their yard, or he'd call the police. The gnome grinned, laughed, and gave them the finger. They told the police they'd had an intruder, but the officers, looking around their yard at 4 a.m., found only shoe prints the size of a small child. The gnome came back night after night, holding a yard ornament and eating their fish. They eventually moved the ornaments and put the fish into a tank in the house. They instantly realized they'd made a mistake. One night, after we had moved the fairies and gnomes and fish from the yard, the creature showed up at the usual time, 3 a.m., she said. When it found that the yard ornaments were gone and the fish were gone, it went crazy. It was yelling and screaming something that we couldn't understand, but we did understand that this thing was pissed, and it wanted us to know it. The gnome ran around the house, screaming and gurgling. Then Charlie realized the dog door was unlocked. It was big enough for our dogs to go through, and it would be big enough for that creature to go through as well, she said. I took off running down to the kitchen, and as I got there, the dogs had started barking like crazy at the doggy door. She shut and secured the dog door, then ran upstairs to shut the windows. A fear hit me like nothing I had ever felt before, and I ran up to the twins' bedroom, where they were both sound asleep in their cribs, she said. Neither parent slept that night. They decided to leave the farm at Porterville. The last we heard of that creature was a very loud screeching, cackling sound, she said. It was under one of the living room windows, and when my husband went to check it out, he saw the top of that creature's hat under the window. Right then, we decided that we were out of there. We couldn't stay there with that creature. The author of this article then says this: Did Tammy and Charlie live in the same house? I wanted to know, so I told Charlie about Tammy's experience. The description of that barn and everything else sounds just like it, and the Tool River runs behind the house, Charlie said. It's too creepy to think that there are more of those creatures. I would like to speak to those other people and find out if we were in the same house, or close to it. The author then says, I put Charlie in contact with Tammy. Charlie sent me an email, and she described the house that she lived in, Tammy said. She started naming some of the side streets, and then I knew it was the same house, or really close to it. The women eventually met and drove to the property. It definitely was the same place, Tammy said. As Tammy stood looking at the house, where a 3-foot-tall man with pointed teeth and evil cackle had laughed at her, she saw someone had torn down the barn. Even with that shack torn down, the whole place still had an eerie feel to it, and I don't know if that is because of what we dealt with while living there, or just the place itself, Charlie said. I don't think I'll be going back there again. Before they left, the women approached their old house and knocked on the door. The current resident did not want them there. She was just hateful, and when we tried to ask her about the barn, she pretty much told us to get lost, and not in those nice words, Tammy said. Charlie was equally taken back. We tried to ask about the shack, and if she had ever had experienced anything while it was there, but she didn't want to talk to us, Charlie said. In fact, she told us to leave the property. She didn't have to tell me twice. I was happy to get away from there. If you're thinking that things couldn't get any more bizarre, I couldn't agree with you more, but the next encounter that I found proves to be even stranger, but on another level. This encounter involves a woman named Janice Bakewell and her dog. This is her story. Janice Bakewell encountered a small UFO, as in extremely small, in Marlborough, Wiltshire, England, in January 1977. Janice was walking through the woods with her dog. It was early one morning when she heard a loud buzzing sound that quickly filled her ears, and clearly those of her dog too. Puzzled, she looked around, but it was all to no avail, at least for around 2 minutes. Then, everything became amazingly clear. As if out of nowhere, a small flying saucer appeared before her, hovering at a height of around 4 feet off the ground, in a small clearing in the trees. It was circular in shape, silver in color, and had a red band around its middle, and it was barely 4 feet across. She watched, astonished, as the diminutive craft settled to the ground in decidedly wobbly fashion, and a small door opened. Janice still recalls holding her breath, wondering what might happen next. She soon found out. Out of the door flew 3 to 4 inch tall, small humanoid figures. Clearly female and glowing brightly, they fluttered around Janice for a minute or two, dressed in silvery miniskirts. At one point the tiny trio landed on Janice's right arm, smiled, then flew back into the craft, which shot away into the sky, never to be seen again. I think it's safe to say that some of the most unexplainable and completely bewildering encounters definitely involve fae folk, or at the very least, creatures that are portraying themselves as such. I realize that the majority of tonight's stories focus heavily on either trolls or gnomes, which are only a small cross-section of the fae, but this is only the first of many episodes that I'll be doing on the subject. Before I leave you tonight, I have one more encounter that I think you'll find interesting. It involves a man named Steve Oldale. His encounter took place near Schiehallion in Scotland, a location known to locals as Fairy Hill. Steve's encounter is unique, as he witnessed 2 small beings, one of them which was right beside him. Working in tandem, these creatures seemed to be trying to separate Steve's shadow from his body, using a pair of shears. Have a listen.
It was 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening. It started getting kind of remarkable, and out of this blue sky, a kind of wisp of cloud came across, and I think gauze-like, I think would describe it. You could easily see through it, but it kind of sort of drifted in. And so I was watching that, thinking, yes, that's nice, enjoying the scenery. And then a very small amount of dew vapour sort of came down from that. You could just see the sort of tiny drops. With the sun behind me, Schiehallion before me, it cast a rainbow sort of right over Schiehallion. I was like, yes, it's wonderful. I felt privileged to be there. I thought, this is good. There's a stream between me and the mountain, probably about the same distance away as this stream here, about 100 yards perhaps at the most. And I was kind of tinkling away. And I started to hear it as music, as, I suppose what you'd term as fairy music, kind of Irish harp music, or sort of some Scottish music of some kind, sort of stuff. And I was kind of almost enraptured, I suppose, thinking, what a lucky person I am, being here now. And on the edge of my vision, the kind of lower vision, I was kind of looking up at the mountain. Kind of down here at the bottom, I kind of caught a movement with my eye. look down, and there's this small guy, a wee fellow, I suppose you'd call him, be about 4 foot high. But what it's about is rolling my shadow up, is at my head. It's about halfway down the head. Yeah? It's kind of got it into a tube about so big. It's very business-like, rolling away at my head. And then kind of lower down, I saw it, he kind of looked at me, and then his eyes dropped. My shadow's quite long, 40 yards or whatever, but I could perceive that he kind of looked down at my feet. I looked down to my feet, and there was his female counterpart, a pair of silver shears. You wouldn't call them scissors, really. They're sort of like sheep shears or something like that, old-fashioned things. And she's working away around my toe, cutting the shadow off at my toe. My sensation was like what? What's going on here? This is outrageous. I kind of looked back at him and kind of checked the scene out, and then I just sort of went, oi! It's just like that, oi. And he looked at her, and she looked at him, and poof, was gone. Just gone. I sort of looked around, did anybody else see that? There's nobody for miles. My sensation was like astonishment, but not angry, not frightened or fearsome or anything like that. It was just, cheeky wee bastards, really, I suppose, is what I thought. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Great. The nearest thing I've seen to them is these bog people they dug up in the Netherlands with a really tan skin. Their skin was kind of, really like that. They weren't bearded. There was some facial hair. The one being closer, I could see the facial hair on her, and it was substantial, if you like, but not what you'd call bearded. Filthy, I'm a builder, my hands get dirty, but these fingernails they were seriously in bad shape. You could do with a wash. The clothes were all made of leather of some kind of like chamois leather. The small hats kind of sewed together quite crudely, kind of a smock tied around the middle with some kind of fabric underneath it. And equally manky, equally sort of not covered in muck, but like sort of seeped, deeply ingrained. Yeah, as if they'd sort of come out of the bog. But they were dry, they weren't wet as if they'd come out of a bog, but, as if they'd been stained by a bog. The bog people that really sums them up for me, visually, even down to the wizened sort of skin. No, I don't think they were trying to do me any favours. It doesn't seem like a favour to somebody to take your shadow away. It sounds like death of some kind, or permanent insanity is what I would imagine if they took your shadow. It'd be some kind of crazy thing locked up in a cell somewhere. So I don't really feel that I owe them any favours. And perhaps people should know about this. There's all kinds of possibilities for people, and if there are creatures from another that can just disappear and appear at will and mess about with our lives, tinker with my life. I think people should be aware of this. Yeah. Not that it seems to happen to many people, but it is a possibility. And I don't think people should close their minds to it. Having said that, having my mind open to it, I've many times tried to recreate, the kind of feeling I've wandered through the hills in a lackadaisical fashion, waiting for something like this to happen again. But nothing, drawn a blank every time. I've seen rainbows, I've heard streams, but I've never heard, like that music. I've never seen a cloud appear from out of a blue sky from nowhere and, produce a rainbow to entrance me. But I would like it to happen again. Yeah. I'd like some more encounter, just to see what they're about.
So again, I ask the question, do you believe in fairies? Or maybe the more appropriate question is, do you believe in fae folk? Rarely do we have tangible evidence that proves that what we experience is real. But as with most paranormal phenomena, I think seeing is believing. And for many of us, that's all that matters. If you believe that you or someone that you know has witnessed something unexplainable, and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, you can contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. Please remember that no matter how insignificant or outlandish you believe your experience may seem, I'd like to hear about it. You can also connect with us by joining our forum and by following us on social media. All of our contact information, as well as the sources that were referenced for today's episode, can be found in the show notes. If you're wondering how you can support the podcast, you can help by subscribing to the show and sharing it with your friends. If you're ready to take the next step and become a patron, you can visit patreon.com/paranormal mysteries. Benefits include ad-free episodes and early access to select shows. New episodes of the Paranormal Mysteries podcast are available every Sunday, with the new midweek mysteries airing every Wednesday, and they're available on all of your favorite podcast apps. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries podcast, thank you for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.